I never thought I'd witness my father's face turn completely white or see my perfect sister Rebecca literally stumble backward in shock. But that's exactly what happened when my Ferrari keys came tumbling out of my jacket pocket and clattered across the hardwood floor during Rebecca's engagement party. One moment, my dad was proudly declaring to a room full of 40 guests that my sister was the one we can finally be proud of. And the next moment, everyone was staring at those unmistakable prancing horse keys lying at Rebecca's designer heels, while I stood there as the family disappointment who apparently owned a $250,000 sports car. You see, for the past 6 years, I've been living what my family considered a failure's lifestyle while secretly building something they never saw coming. The moment those keys hit the floor and that distinctive metallic sound echoed through our family's living room, everything they thought they knew about their disappointing daughter shattered in an instant. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jessica Parker, and I've spent the last 6 years being the black sheep of the Thompson-Parker family here in Charlotte, North Carolina. While my seemingly modest existence as a freelance web developer working from a cramped downtown apartment might appear perfectly normal to most people, to my achievement-obsessed family, it represented everything they feared their children might become. I can still hear the disappointment in my mother Linda's voice during my 24th birthday dinner, when she glanced at my secondhand laptop and sighed that heavy sigh mothers perfect when they're about to deliver a life lecture. Jessica, sweetheart, when are you going to stop this computer phase and find a real career? Your sister Rebecca has already made senior marketing manager, and she's looking at condos in Myers Park. The sting of that comparison had become as familiar as my morning coffee, but by that point I'd developed thick skin when it came to being the cautionary tale at every family gathering. You know how some families have that one relative everyone whispers about? That was me. Except instead of being the drunk uncle or the aunt who never married, I was the daughter who chose creativity over conformity. Rebecca, my older sister by 4 years, embodied everything my parents dreamed their children would become. She graduated summa cum laude from UNC with her business degree, landed her first corporate job before graduation, and had been climbing the ladder at a major banking firm ever since. Her life looked like something straight out of a career counselor's success story. Perfect credit score, company car, matching dinnerware, and a boyfriend named Michael who worked in investment management and owned 3 suits that cost more than my monthly rent. Rebecca lived in a trendy apartment in South End, drove a leased Audi that she mentioned in conversation at least twice per visit, and maintained a social media presence that looked like a LinkedIn advertisement come to life. She attended networking events, played golf on weekends, and could discuss market trends with the confidence of someone who had never doubted that success meant climbing a corporate ladder that someone else had built. Then there was my younger brother Kevin, who despite being 2 years my junior, had somehow managed to position himself above me in the family hierarchy through sheer audacity and charm. Kevin possessed what my father Robert called natural business instincts, which apparently meant he could talk confidently about cryptocurrency investments and day trading strategies he'd learned from YouTube videos. Never mind that he'd switched majors 3 times in college and was currently living in our parents' basement while developing his investment portfolio. Kevin could speak the language of money, and in our family, that counted for more than actual results. My parents treated Kevin's theoretical business ventures with the same respect they gave Rebecca's concrete achievements, while my actual income from web development was dismissed as playing around on computers. It didn't matter that I paid my own bills, maintained my own apartment, and had been financially independent since college. In their minds, success wore a suit and worked in an office building with a reception desk and corporate hierarchy. Checky. Only person in our family who ever saw past the surface was my grandmother, Margaret Parker, my father's mother who everyone called Nana Maggie. While the rest of the family gathered for formal dinners where conversations revolved around stock portfolios and career advancement, Nana Maggie would slip away to visit my small apartment where I worked on client projects late into the evening. "Show me what magic you're creating today, Jessie," she'd say, settling into the worn armchair I'd rescued from a thrift store and positioned next to my desk setup. Nana Maggie was the only person who used that nickname, and she was the only family member who seemed genuinely interested in understanding what I actually did for work. She'd watch me code websites, design user interfaces, and troubleshoot technical problems with the same fascination other people reserved for watching artists paint masterpieces. About 4 months before she passed away last spring, we had what would become our final meaningful conversation. I was working late on a particularly complex e-commerce site for a local boutique when she appeared at my door with takeout containers from my favorite Thai restaurant. She'd made the 20-minute drive from her assisted living facility just to bring me dinner and check on my work. "There's something remarkable about how you solve problems that don't have obvious answers," she said, watching me navigate through lines of code that might as well have been hieroglyphics to most people. The others in this family see traditional paths and conventional success stories. You see opportunities that don't exist yet and create solutions that nobody else thought of. I deflected the compliment the way I always did, uncomfortable with praise after years of family criticism. "That's a nice way to look at it, Nana, but it doesn't exactly impress the rest of the family. To them, I'm just the daughter who never got a real job." Nana Maggie's eyes developed that mischievous twinkle that appeared whenever she was about to share some piece of wisdom disguised as casual conversation. "Don't be so certain about what impresses people, Jessie. Sometimes the most successful people are the ones who don't need to announce their success to feel important. Real achievement speaks for itself when the right moment comes." If I had known those would be among her last words to me, I might have pressed her to explain what she meant. Instead, I simply hugged her and thanked her for the dinner, and we spent the rest of the evening talking about my latest client project and her plans to visit her sister in Asheville. She died peacefully in her sleep 6 weeks later, leaving behind a family that had never fully appreciated her wisdom and a granddaughter who missed her more than words could express. Family gatherings at my parents' house in the affluent Ballantine neighborhood became increasingly difficult after Nana Maggie's funeral. The large colonial with its perfectly manicured lawn and professionally decorated interior felt cold without her presence, and the conversations seemed to focus even more intensely on conventional measures of success now that the one person who valued different perspectives was gone. Holiday celebrations were particularly brutal experiences. I'd arrive with gifts I'd carefully chosen or sometimes created myself, watching them get politely acknowledged before being overshadowed by Rebecca's expensive presents and Kevin's grand promises about future business ventures. Christmas morning typically involved Rebecca showing off some new piece of jewelry Michael had given her, while Kevin would monopolize the conversation with stories about his latest investment strategy or cryptocurrency discovery. I'd sit at what felt like the kids' table well into my 20s, listening to discussions about career advancement, property values, and retirement planning, while my work was categorized as a hobby that I'd hopefully outgrow once I decided to pursue a real career. The fact that my freelance income had been steadily increasing year after year seemed irrelevant compared to Rebecca's corporate benefits package and Kevin's theoretical millions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Last Thanksgiving, I overheard my mother explaining my situation to my Aunt Carol, who had asked why I wasn't married or settled down like Rebecca. "Jessica's still finding herself," Mom said with that particular tone parents use when they're embarrassed by their children's choices. "She's got this whole computer thing going on, but we're hoping she'll eventually realize that you can't build a real life on freelance work. Maybe she'll go back to school for something more practical." The way she said "computer thing" made my profession sound like a childhood phase, equivalent to collecting stickers or playing with dolls. Never mind that I'd been supporting myself completely for 4 years, had built a client base that kept me busier than I wanted to be, and was earning more money than Kevin had ever seen despite his constant talk about future fortunes. But I'd learned to keep my financial reality to myself after years of having every small victory minimized or explained away. When I'd landed my first major client contract 2 years earlier, my father had suggested it was probably a fluke. When I'd moved from my studio apartment to a one-bedroom place with better internet and a dedicated office space, my mother had wondered aloud whether I was being financially irresponsible. When I'd bought my first new car instead of driving used vehicles, Rebecca had made comments about the importance of saving money for the future instead of splurging on unnecessary luxuries. The pattern was clear. Nothing I accomplished would ever be taken seriously by this family, so I stopped sharing my accomplishments altogether. I developed a habit of downplaying my success, describing lucrative contracts as decent projects, and referring to my growing savings account as getting by okay. It seemed easier than constantly defending my choices to people who had already decided that anything outside their narrow definition of success wasn't worth respecting. What my family didn't know was that 8 months earlier, everything had changed in ways I could never have anticipated. I'd been working with a small digital marketing agency on various web development projects when they connected me with a startup company called GreenPath Solutions. The company had developed an innovative app designed to help small businesses reduce their environmental impact while saving money on operational costs, but they needed a complete digital overhaul to make their platform user-friendly and scalable. The initial contract seemed straightforward: redesign their website, optimize their app interface, and create a cohesive digital brand identity. But as I dove deeper into the project, I realized that GreenPath had created something potentially revolutionary. Their algorithm could analyze a business's operations and provide specific recommendations for reducing waste, energy consumption, and unnecessary expenses while improving efficiency and profitability. The problem was that their existing digital platform looked like it had been designed by engineers for other engineers. Small business owners couldn't navigate the interface. The data visualization was incomprehensible to non-technical users. And the overall user experience was so clunky that potential customers were abandoning the platform within minutes of signing up. I spent 3 months completely rebuilding their digital presence from the ground up. I redesigned their app interface to be intuitive for busy business owners, created clear data dashboards that translated complex analytics into actionable insights, and developed a website that explained their services in plain language that didn't require an environmental science degree to understand. The transformation was dramatic. Within 2 months of launching the new platform, GreenPath's user engagement increased by 400%. Small businesses that had previously struggled with the original interface were now actively using the app and recommending it to other business owners. The company went from having 300 struggling users to over 15,000 active subscribers. That's when GreenPath's founders, Sarah and David Chen, made me an offer that changed my life forever. Instead of paying me the remaining balance on my contract in cash, they offered me a choice. I could take my final payment of $12,000, or I could accept equity in the company equivalent to that amount, plus a percentage of future growth. Most freelancers would have taken the guaranteed cash payment, especially someone like me who had been conditioned to believe that steady income was more important than speculative investments. But something about the project felt different. I'd seen how dramatically the platform improvements had affected user engagement, and I believed GreenPath was positioned to become something much bigger than a small startup. I took the equity. 3 months later, GreenPath Solutions was acquired by Ecotech Industries, a major corporation that specialized in sustainable business solutions, for $37 million. My equity stake, which had seemed like a risky gamble when I'd accepted it instead of cash payment, was suddenly worth $2.4 million. The acquisition happened on a Tuesday morning in March. I was sitting in my apartment, working on a routine website update for a local restaurant, when Sarah, Chen called to deliver the news that would fundamentally change my financial reality. I remember staring at my laptop screen, trying to process what she was telling me, feeling like I was living in someone else's life. "Jessica, I know this is a lot to take in," Sarah said, her voice filled with excitement and gratitude. "But you need to understand that without your work on the platform, this acquisition never would have happened. Your redesign didn't just improve our user experience, it made us acquisition-worthy. You deserve every penny of this payout." I spent the rest of that day walking around Charlotte in a daze, trying to wrap my mind around the fact that I'd gone from living paycheck to having more money than my parents had probably saved in their entire careers. The irony wasn't lost on me that the family disappointment who worked on computer things had just achieved more financial success than the golden children who had followed all the traditional rules. But instead of rushing to share the news with my family, I found myself hesitant to tell them anything at all. Years of having my work dismissed and my choices questioned had taught me to keep my victories private, and this felt too big and too fragile to risk having it minimized or explained away. I decided to keep the windfall secret until I figured out how to handle this new reality. I paid off my student loans, moved my money into various investment accounts, and continued living in my modest apartment while I processed what had happened and planned my next moves. To anyone watching my day-to-day life, nothing had changed. I still worked on freelance projects, still drove my reliable Honda Civic, still shopped at the same grocery stores, and ate at the same casual restaurants I'd always frequented. The only indulgence I allowed myself was the Ferrari. I'd never been a car enthusiast, but something about owning a piece of automotive art appealed to the part of me that had spent years being told my creative work wasn't valuable. I found a 2019 Ferrari 488 Spider at a dealership in Atlanta and bought it with cash on a Saturday afternoon, driving it back to Charlotte in a state of disbelief that this machine actually belonged to me. I kept the Ferrari in a private garage facility downtown, telling myself I was being practical about security and weather protection. But the truth was that I wasn't ready to answer the questions that would inevitably come if my family saw me driving a car that cost more than most people's houses. I continued taking public transportation or walking to most places, driving the Ferrari only on weekend trips outside the city or late evening drives when I needed to think. For 6 months, I maintained this double life. During the day, I was still Jessica, the struggling freelancer who couldn't afford to eat at nice restaurants or take expensive vacations. But in private moments, I was Jessica, the accidental millionaire who owned a supercar and had more financial freedom than she knew how to handle. The psychological weight of keeping such a massive secret was exhausting. I wanted to share my success with people who mattered to me, but years of family conditioning had taught me that my version of success would never be good enough for their approval. I convinced myself that it was better to keep quiet than to risk having the most important achievement of my life dismissed as luck or accident. Everything came to a head when Rebecca announced her engagement to Michael last month. My parents immediately began planning what my mother described as a proper celebration to honor their daughter's next step toward the perfect life they'd always envisioned for her. "Jessica, we're hosting an engagement party for Rebecca and Michael next Saturday evening," my mother informed me during one of her weekly check-in calls that always felt more like progress reports than genuine conversations. "All of Rebecca's colleagues will be there, plus Michael's family and our close friends. It's important that you attend, and please make sure you dress appropriately. This is Rebecca's moment to shine, and we want everything to be perfect." The subtext was unmistakable. Don't embarrass the family in front of the successful people who matter. I agreed to attend, already dreading another evening of listening to conversations about career achievements and financial milestones while being treated like the cautionary tale about what happens when you don't follow conventional wisdom. What my family didn't realize was that while they'd been planning Rebecca's celebration, I'd been making plans of my own. The previous week, I'd put an offer on a penthouse apartment in the heart of downtown Charlotte, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows, a private balcony overlooking the city, and a parking space where I could finally keep my Ferrari without hiding it from the world. I'd also been working on launching my own digital agency, using my newfound financial freedom to hire talented developers and designers who shared my vision for creating user-friendly technology solutions for businesses that couldn't afford major corporate consulting fees. The agency was still in its early stages, but we'd already signed 3 clients and were building a reputation for delivering exceptional results at reasonable prices. But none of my family knew about any of these developments. As far as they were concerned, I was still the same struggling freelancer who lived in a modest apartment and took the bus everywhere because I couldn't afford car payments. The morning of Rebecca's engagement party, I stood in my small apartment, trying to decide what to wear to another evening of being the family disappointment. I chose a simple black dress I'd bought at a department store, paired with jewelry I'd inherited from Nana Maggie, and shoes that were comfortable enough for standing around making small talk with people who would rather I wasn't there. As I was getting ready to leave, I grabbed my jacket and instinctively checked the pockets for my phone, wallet, and keys. What I didn't realize was that I'd grabbed the wrong keys. Instead of my apartment keys, I'd picked up the Ferrari keychain that I usually kept in a drawer next to my bed. The keychain was distinctive, with the iconic prancing horse logo clearly visible on black leather, but I didn't notice the mistake as I headed out the door. I was too focused on mentally preparing myself for an evening of polite conversation and subtle condescension from family members who had never quite figured out how to interact with me. The party was already in full swing when I arrived at my parents' house. The living room was filled with 40 or 50 people, all dressed in the kind of business casual attire that screamed success and stability. Rebecca looked radiant in a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, holding court in the center of the room while Michael stood beside her looking every inch the successful investment manager he was. I found myself gravitating toward the edges of the gathering, nursing a glass of wine, and making polite conversation with family friends who asked generic questions about my work before quickly moving on to more interesting topics. It was the same dynamic I'd experienced at every family event for the past 6 years. Present but peripheral, included but not important. That's when my father decided to make his speech. Robert Parker had always possessed a flair for dramatic moments, and he clearly viewed this engagement party as an opportunity to publicly celebrate the daughter who had fulfilled all his parental dreams. He moved to the center of the living room, tapping his wine glass with a cocktail fork to get everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for just a moment," he began, his voice carrying that formal tone he reserved for important announcements. "Linda, and I wanted to say a few words about our daughter Rebecca and her engagement to Michael." The room quieted respectfully, turning toward my father with the kind of attention that suggested these were people accustomed to listening to speeches at corporate events and formal gatherings. As parents, we've always hoped that our children would find their way to successful, fulfilling lives, Dad continued, his chest puffing out slightly with pride. We've watched them make choices, face challenges, and grow into the adults they were meant to become. Tonight, I can stand before all of you and say that Rebecca is the one we can finally be proud of. The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd heard variations of this sentiment my entire life. But hearing it spoken aloud, in front of 40 witnesses, felt different, more final, more definitively dismissive of everything I'd accomplished or could ever hope to accomplish. "Rebecca has achieved everything we hoped for as parents," my father went on, his voice gaining momentum as he warmed to his theme. "Career success, financial stability, a wonderful partner who shares her values, and a bright future that reflects the best of what this family represents." Polite applause filled the room as Rebecca beamed and Michael put his arm around her shoulders. They looked like the perfect couple celebrating the perfect life, surrounded by people who understood and valued their version of success. But Dad wasn't finished with his speech. "It's not always easy when you have children who choose different paths in life," he said, and I felt every eye in the room briefly glance in my direction. Some children take longer to find their way, and some choose roads that don't lead where you'd hope they would go. But tonight is about celebrating the child who understood what it means to build a real life, who made the right choices, and who represents everything we've tried to teach our children about success and responsibility. The implication was crystal clear to everyone in that room. Rebecca was the success story, and I was the cautionary tale. The daughter who had gotten it right, and the daughter who had gotten it wrong. The child they could proudly claim, and the child they tolerated out of obligation. As the applause continued and people began offering congratulations to Rebecca and Michael, I reached into my jacket pocket to check my phone. I wanted to see what time it was so I could calculate how long I needed to stay before I could politely excuse myself and escape this celebration of everything I would never be in my family's eyes. That's when my fingers found the keychain. For a split second, I felt confused about why my keys felt different than usual. Then I realized what I was holding, and my heart began racing as I understood the implications of what was about to happen. But it was too late to stop the momentum. My phone had gotten tangled with the keychain, and as I tried to extract it from my pocket, both items came tumbling out of my jacket. The phone hit the hardwood floor with a soft thud and bounced harmlessly under a nearby chair. The Ferrari keys hit with a distinctive metallic clink that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent room, sliding across the polished floor before coming to rest directly at Rebecca's feet. For what felt like an eternity, nobody moved. 40 successful, articulate adults stood frozen, staring at the unmistakable prancing horse logo gleaming under the living room's chandelier light. Rebecca looked down at the keys, then up at me, then back down at the keys as if she couldn't quite process what she was seeing. Michael, who knew cars the way some people know fine wine, was the first person to find his voice. "Those are Ferrari keys," he said, his words barely above a whisper but carrying clearly through the absolute silence that had fallen over the room. My father's face had gone completely pale, his mouth slightly open as he struggled to understand how his disappointment of a daughter could possibly be connected to a keychain that represented more money than most people earned in 5 years. "Jessica," he said slowly, as if he were afraid that speaking too quickly might make the keys disappear or reveal them to be some kind of elaborate joke. "Whose keys are those?" Every person in that room was staring at me, waiting for an explanation. That would make sense of what they were seeing. I could have lied. I could have claimed I was holding the keys for someone else, or that they were a promotional item from some car show, or that they belonged to a client who had asked me to keep them for some reason. But standing there in that moment, with my father's words about being the one we can finally be proud of still hanging in the air, something inside me shifted. For 6 years, I'd allowed this family to define my worth based on their narrow understanding of success. I'd kept my achievements small and my victories private to avoid challenging their preconceptions about what my life should look like. I was tired of being small. I was tired of apologizing for succeeding in ways they didn't understand. I was tired of protecting their feelings at the expense of my own self-respect. "They're mine," I said, my voice steady and clear in the silent room. The collective intake of breath was audible. 40 people simultaneously trying to process information that didn't fit with everything they thought they knew about the family disappointment who took the bus and lived in a tiny apartment. Rebecca's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the shock on her face. "That's impossible," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "You can't afford a Ferrari. You live in that cramped apartment downtown and you're always talking about client payments being late." "I live in that apartment because I choose to," I replied, walking over to pick up my keys with steady hands. "And the Ferrari is parked 3 blocks away because I didn't want to seem presumptuous driving it to your engagement party." My mother found her voice next, though it came out as more of a croak than her usual controlled tone. "Jessica, how is this possible? You're a freelance web designer. You work on computers. What I told them next changed everything they thought they knew about their disappointing daughter, and everything they believed about success, achievement, and the value of taking risks that don't fit conventional wisdom. What I revealed to my stunned family that evening was a story that began 8 months earlier with what seemed like just another routine client project. I had been working steadily with a digital marketing agency called Creative Solutions, handling their overflow web development projects when their regular developers were overbooked. The work was reliable, if not particularly exciting, mostly small business websites and basic e-commerce platforms that paid the bills but didn't challenge my technical abilities. That changed when Amanda Rodriguez, the agency's creative director, called me on a Wednesday morning in February with what she described as an unusual opportunity. "Jessica, I have a potential client that might be perfect for you," she said, her voice carrying an excitement I rarely heard when she discussed routine projects. "It's a startup called GreenPath Solutions, and they need someone who can think beyond basic web development. They've got an incredible product, but their digital presence is apparently a disaster." Amanda explained that GreenPath had developed sophisticated software designed to help small and medium-sized businesses reduce their environmental impact while simultaneously cutting operational costs. The concept was brilliant in its simplicity. Their algorithm could analyze a company's energy usage, waste production, supply chain efficiency, and resource consumption, then provide specific, actionable recommendations that would benefit both the environment and the bottom line. "The problem is that their current platform looks like it was designed by engineers for other engineers," Amanda continued. "Small business owners take one look at it and immediately click away because they can't figure out how to use it. The founders are incredibly smart, but they need someone who understands user experience and can translate complex data into something accessible for regular people." I agreed to meet with the GreenPath team the following Friday at their modest office in a converted warehouse space in the Noda neighborhood. The building was typical of Charlotte's growing tech scene: exposed brick walls, polished concrete floors, and large windows that let in plenty of natural light. But what struck me immediately was how different this felt from the sterile corporate environments where Rebecca and her colleagues worked. Sarah Chen and David Martinez, the co-founders of GreenPath, greeted me with enthusiasm that felt genuine rather than professionally manufactured. Sarah had a PhD in environmental science from Duke University and had spent 5 years working for the EPA before becoming frustrated with the slow pace of government-driven environmental initiatives. David brought 15 years of software development experience from various tech companies, plus an MBA that he'd earned while working full-time and raising 2 young children. We started GreenPath because we realized that most environmental solutions focus on individual consumer behavior or massive corporate initiatives, Sarah explained, as we settled into their small conference room with coffee served in mismatched mugs that looked like they'd been collected from various promotional events. But there's this huge middle ground of small businesses that want to be more environmentally responsible, but don't have the resources to hire sustainability consultants or implement major changes. David pulled up their existing platform on his laptop, and I immediately understood why their user engagement was so low. The interface was a maze of technical jargon, complicated charts, and data visualizations that would confuse anyone without an environmental science background. The color scheme was harsh, the navigation was counterintuitive, and the overall user experience felt like trying to pilot a spaceship when all you wanted to do was check your email. We've had over 2,000 businesses sign up for trials in the past year, David said, his frustration evident in his voice. But our conversion rate to paid subscriptions is less than 3%. People create accounts, spend about 5 minutes trying to figure out how to use the platform, and then they never come back. As they walked me through the software's capabilities, I realized that GreenPath had created something potentially revolutionary. Their algorithm could analyze a restaurant's operations and suggest specific changes like switching to LED lighting, adjusting HVAC scheduling, or partnering with local suppliers to reduce transportation costs. For a retail store, it might recommend inventory management strategies that reduced waste while improving cash flow, or energy-efficient equipment upgrades that would pay for themselves within 2 years. The recommendations weren't vague suggestions like, be more environmentally friendly. They were specific, actionable, and financially beneficial. A coffee shop could learn exactly which supplier changes would reduce their carbon footprint by 20% while saving $800 per month. A small manufacturing company could discover how adjusting their production schedule and equipment maintenance could cut energy costs by 15% while reducing their environmental impact. This is incredible work, I told them honestly. The problem isn't your product. It's that you're hiding it behind an interface that makes it impossible for your target users to access all this value. Sarah leaned forward with interest. What would you do differently? I spent the next hour sketching out ideas for completely reimagining their user experience. Instead of bombarding users with technical data, the platform should start with simple questions about their business type, size, and primary concerns. Instead of complex charts, it should provide clear, visual progress indicators that showed environmental impact and cost savings in terms that any business owner could understand immediately. Think about it like this, I explained, drawing rough wireframes on their whiteboard. Your users don't need to understand the science behind your recommendations. They need to know 3 things. What should I do? How much will it cost? And how much will I save? Everything else should be available if they want to dig deeper. But the core value proposition should be clear within 30 seconds of logging in. By the end of our meeting, I was more excited about a potential project than I'd been in months. This wasn't just another website redesign. It was an opportunity to take genuinely valuable technology and make it accessible to thousands of businesses that could benefit from it. We agreed on a contract that was larger than any single project I'd handled before. The scope included completely redesigning their website, rebuilding their app interface from the ground up, creating user onboarding flows that would guide new customers through the platform, and developing a dashboard system that would make complex environmental data understandable for busy business owners. The timeline was ambitious. They wanted everything completed within 4 months so they could relaunch the platform before their existing funding ran out. Sarah and David were honest about their financial situation. They had enough runway to operate for another 8 months, but they needed to dramatically improve their conversion rates, or they'd have to start looking for additional investors or consider shutting down. We believe in this product, Sarah said as we finalized the contract details. But we also know that having great technology isn't enough if people can't figure out how to use it. You're not just redesigning our platform, you're potentially saving our company. The pressure was intense, but so was the opportunity. I threw myself into the project with more focus and energy than I'd brought to any previous work. I spent the first 2 weeks conducting user research, interviewing small business owners about their experiences with environmental initiatives, their technology comfort levels, and their decision-making processes when evaluating new software, tools. What I discovered was that most small business owners were genuinely interested in reducing their environmental impact, but they were overwhelmed by conflicting information and skeptical of solutions that seemed too good to be true. They wanted concrete, proven strategies that wouldn't disrupt their daily operations or require significant upfront investments they couldn't afford. Armed with this research, I began redesigning GreenPath's entire digital experience around the principle of progressive disclosure. New users would start with a simple questionnaire that took less than 5 minutes to complete, providing basic information about their business type, location, approximate size, and primary goals. The platform would then generate an initial assessment with 3 specific recommendations, each showing estimated implementation costs, projected savings, and environmental impact in clear, visual terms. Users who wanted more detailed information could drill down into the science behind the recommendations, access implementation guides, or connect with local vendors who could help with specific changes. but the core value was immediately apparent, without requiring anyone to become an environmental expert or data analyst. I redesigned their website to focus on success stories from real businesses, showing specific examples of how GreenPath's recommendations had helped a local bakery save $1,200 per month while reducing their carbon footprint, or how a small law firm had improved their office efficiency while cutting energy costs by 25%. The app interface was completely rebuilt around a dashboard metaphor that would be familiar to anyone who had ever used a fitness tracker or budgeting app. Instead of complex charts, users saw clear progress indicators showing their environmental impact reduction, cumulative cost savings, and implementation progress toward their stated goals. I created video tutorials that were embedded directly into the platform, showing real business owners explaining how they'd implemented specific recommendations and what results they'd achieved. These weren't polished marketing videos. They were authentic testimonials from people who looked and sounded like GreenPath's target users. The onboarding process was gamified just enough to keep users engaged without feeling like they were playing a children's game. Completing assessments, implementing recommendations, and tracking progress earned badges and unlocked additional features, but the focus remained on real-world business benefits rather than arbitrary point systems. As I worked on the project, I found myself becoming genuinely invested in GreenPath's success in ways that went beyond professional pride. Sarah and David were trying to solve real problems in innovative ways, and their passion for environmental sustainability felt authentic rather than performative. They weren't trying to get rich by jumping on the latest trend. They were building something they believed could make a meaningful difference in the world. I also appreciated their collaborative approach to the redesign process. Unlike many clients, who wanted to micromanage every design decision, Sarah and David trusted my expertise while providing valuable input about their users' needs and the technical capabilities of their system. They were available when I needed their guidance, but didn't hover over my work or second-guess my professional judgment. The technical challenges were significant but manageable. GreenPath's existing system was built on solid foundations. It just needed a better interface layer that would make all that powerful functionality accessible to non-technical users. I worked closely with their development team to ensure that my design recommendations were technically feasible and wouldn't compromise the sophisticated algorithms that made their product valuable. 3 months into the project, we were ready for beta testing with a small group of existing users who had agreed to try the new platform in exchange for extended free trials. The results exceeded everyone's expectations, including my own. Users who had previously abandoned the platform after a few minutes were now spending an average of 23 minutes exploring the new interface during their first session. More importantly, they were actually implementing the recommendations. The beta test group showed a 47% implementation rate for suggested changes, compared to less than 8% with the original platform. Users were uploading photos of their new LED lighting installations, sharing stories about successful vendor switches, and asking for additional recommendations beyond their initial assessments. This is exactly what we dreamed this platform could be, Sarah told me during one of our weekly progress meetings. You've taken our vision and made it real for the people we're trying to help. The full platform relaunch was scheduled for early June, just 4 months after I'd first met. With Sarah and David in their warehouse office, the weeks leading up to the launch were intense, with final testing, content creation, and user experience refinements consuming most of my waking hours. But I'd never felt more energized by work or more confident that what I was building would make a genuine difference. 2 weeks before the scheduled relaunch, Sarah and David asked to meet with me for what they described as an important conversation about the project's future. I assumed they wanted to discuss ongoing maintenance and support for the new platform, or perhaps additional features they wanted to add based on beta user feedback. Instead, they presented me with an offer that would change my life in ways I couldn't have imagined. Jessica, we need to be honest with you about something, David began as we sat in their conference room on a warm Thursday afternoon in late May. When we hired you for this project, We were hoping you'd help us improve our conversion rates enough to attract additional investors, or extend our runway until we could become profitable. Sarah picked up the thread. What you've accomplished goes far beyond anything we expected. You haven't just improved our platform, you've fundamentally transformed our business model. The user engagement metrics from the beta test indicate that we're looking at conversion rates that could make GreenPath profitable within 6 months. They went on to explain that the platform redesign had attracted attention from several potential investors who were interested in GreenPath's improved prospects. Ecotech Industries, a major corporation specializing in sustainable business solutions, had approached them about a possible acquisition that would provide GreenPath with the resources to scale nationally while maintaining their focus on serving small and medium-sized businesses. The preliminary discussions suggest an acquisition price that would be life-changing for everyone involved, David said carefully. But we want you to know that none of this would be possible without your work. You didn't just complete a design project. You made our company acquisition-worthy. What they offered next took my breath away. Instead of simply paying me the remaining balance on our original contract, they wanted to offer me equity in GreenPath equivalent to my outstanding payment plus a percentage of the company's future value. We can't predict exactly what the acquisition will be worth, Sarah explained, but early discussions suggest it could be substantial. If you're willing to take the risk, we'd like to offer you a stake in whatever success comes from this. The decision felt monumental. I could take the guaranteed $12,000 I was owed and walk away with a successful project completed and a great addition to my portfolio. Or I could bet on GreenPath's future and potentially earn much more, or potentially earn nothing if the acquisition fell through. But as I sat in that warehouse conference room, looking at 2 entrepreneurs who had trusted me with their company's future, the choice felt obvious. I believed in what GreenPath was trying to accomplish. I was proud of the work we'd done together, and I wanted to be part of whatever came next. I'll take the equity, I said, and Sarah and David both broke into huge grins. The paperwork was completed within a week, and suddenly I owned a small but meaningful stake in a company that was attracting serious acquisition interest from major corporations. The next few weeks passed in a blur of due diligence meetings, legal reviews, and final preparations for the platform relaunch. The public relaunch of GreenPath's redesigned platform exceeded even our most optimistic projections. Within the first month, they had more new user signups than they'd seen in the previous 6 months combined. More importantly, the conversion rate from free trials to paid subscriptions jumped to 38%, turning GreenPath from a struggling startup into a profitable business almost overnight. The success attracted additional interest from potential acquirers, and by late July, Ecotech Industries had made a formal offer to purchase GreenPath Solutions for $37 million. When Sarah called me that Tuesday morning in early August to tell me that the acquisition had been finalized, I was sitting in my small apartment working on a routine website update for a local restaurant. The irony of receiving life-changing financial news while doing mundane freelance work wasn't lost on me. "Jessica, I hope you're sitting down," Sarah said, her voice barely containing her excitement. "The acquisition closed this morning, and your equity stake is worth $2.4 million. I stared at my laptop screen, trying to process numbers that seemed too large to be real. $2.4 million. More money than my parents had probably saved in their entire careers. More financial security than I'd ever imagined having at 31 years old." "Are you still there?" Sarah asked, laughing. "I know it's a lot to take in." "I'm here," I managed to say. I can't believe this is real." "It's real," she confirmed. "And you earned every penny of it." The due diligence process made it clear that our improved user engagement and conversion rates were the primary factors that made us attractive to Ecotech. Your work didn't just help us, it made this acquisition possible. After we hung up, I spent the rest of the day walking around Charlotte in a state of shock. trying to understand how my life had just changed so dramatically. The girl who had been taking the bus and shopping at discount stores had suddenly become financially independent in ways that most people only dream about. But instead of rushing to tell my family about this windfall, I found myself reluctant to share the news with anyone. Years of having my work dismissed and my choices questioned had conditioned me to keep my successes private, and this felt too important and too fragile to risk having it minimized or explained away as luck. I decided to keep the acquisition, payout secret while I figured out how to handle this new reality. I paid off my student loans, established investment accounts, and continued living modestly while I processed what had happened and planned my next steps. The only indulgence I allowed myself was the Ferrari. I'd never been particularly interested in luxury cars, but something about owning a piece of automotive engineering appealed to me after years of being told that my technical work wasn't valuable. I spent weeks researching different models before, settling on a 2019 Ferrari 488 Spider in Rosso Corsa Red that I found at a dealership in Atlanta. Walking into that dealership with the intention of buying a $250,000 car with cash felt surreal. The salesperson, a polished man named Marcus, who was probably accustomed to dealing with established, wealthy clients, seemed skeptical when I expressed serious interest in the Ferrari until I provided proof of funds and completed the purchase paperwork without financing or trade-ins. Driving the Ferrari back to Charlotte on Interstate 85 was one of the most exhilarating experiences of my life. The car responded to every input with precision that felt almost telepathic, and the sound of the V8 engine was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. For those 2 hours on the highway, I felt like I was living in someone else's life. But as I approached Charlotte, reality began to set in. How do you explain to a family that considers you a failure that you suddenly own a car that costs more than most people's houses? How do you integrate a Ferrari into a lifestyle that revolves around taking public transportation and shopping at Target? I decided to keep the car at a private storage facility downtown, telling myself I was being practical about security and weather protection. The truth was that I wasn't ready to answer the inevitable questions that would come if anyone in my family discovered I owned a supercar. For the next 6 months, I maintained an elaborate double life. During family gatherings and social interactions, I remained Jessica, the struggling freelancer who lived modestly and couldn't afford expensive luxuries. But in private moments, I was Jessica, the millionaire who owned a Ferrari and had more financial freedom than she knew how to use. The psychological toll of keeping such a significant secret was exhausting. I wanted to share my success with people who mattered to me, but years of family conditioning had taught me that my version of achievement would never meet their standards for what constituted real success. I convinced myself that it was better to maintain the status quo than to risk having the most important accomplishment of my life dismissed as a fluke or attributed to luck rather than skill and hard work. This internal conflict came to a head when Rebecca announced her engagement to Michael in early February. My parents immediately began planning what they described as a proper celebration to honor Rebecca's achievement in landing a successful husband who complemented her own career. Accomplishments. Jessica, we're hosting an engagement party for Rebecca and Michael on Saturday evening. My mother informed me during one of her weekly check-in calls that always felt more like performance reviews than genuine family conversations. Rebecca's entire department will be there, plus Michael's colleagues and family. It's going to be a wonderful celebration of everything they've accomplished together. The implicit message was clear. This party would showcase the kind of success and stability that the family valued, with Rebecca and Michael serving as examples of what happened when you made the right choices and followed conventional wisdom about career and relationships. I need you to be there, Jessica, Mom continued, and please make sure you dress appropriately for the occasion. This is Rebecca's moment, and we want everything to be perfect. I agreed to attend, already dreading another evening of being the cautionary tale at a gathering designed to celebrate everything I supposedly wasn't. What my family didn't know was that while they'd been planning Rebecca's engagement celebration, I'd been making significant changes in my own life. The previous month, I'd purchased a penthouse apartment in downtown Charlotte's most exclusive residential building. The 3-bedroom unit featured floor-to-ceiling windows with panoramic city views, a private balcony, premium appliances, and a secured parking garage where I could finally keep my Ferrari without hiding it from the world. I'd also been developing plans for launching my own digital agency, using my financial freedom to hire talented developers and designers who shared my vision for creating user-friendly technology solutions for businesses that couldn't afford traditional corporate consulting services. The agency was still in planning stages, but I'd already identified potential team members and begun developing our service offerings. Additionally, I'd been quietly working on a nonprofit initiative focused on providing pro bono digital services to environmentally focused small businesses, inspired by my experience with GreenPath and motivated by a desire to use my skills for meaningful social impact. But none of my family knew about any of these developments. As far as they were concerned, I was still the same struggling freelancer who lived in a cramped apartment and took public transportation because I couldn't afford car payments or parking fees. The morning of Rebecca's engagement party, I stood in my modest apartment trying to decide what to wear to another evening of subtle condescension and polite dismissal. I chose a simple black dress from my existing wardrobe, paired with jewelry I'd inherited from Nana Maggie, and comfortable shoes that would be suitable for standing around making small talk with people who would rather I wasn't there. As I prepared to leave, I went through my usual routine of checking that I had my phone, wallet, and keys. What I didn't realize was that I'd inadvertently grabbed the wrong keychain. Instead of my regular apartment keys, I'd picked up the distinctive Ferrari, keys that I usually kept hidden in a drawer beside my bed. The keychain was impossible to mistake for anything else, with its iconic prancing horse logo prominently displayed on black leather. But I was too preoccupied with mentally preparing for the evening ahead to notice what I'd grabbed. I was focused on steeling myself for hours of polite conversation with people who saw me as the family disappointment, listening to discussions about career advancement and financial planning, while my own achievements remained invisible and unacknowledged. The party was already crowded when I arrived at my parents' house in Ballantine. The spacious living room was filled with well-dressed professionals, all engaged in the kind of networking conversations that sounded like LinkedIn profiles come to life. Rebecca looked stunning in a designer dress that probably cost more than I used to spend on clothes in 6 months, while Michael worked the room with the confident charm of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. I found myself gravitating toward the periphery of the gathering, holding a glass of wine and making obligatory small talk with family friends who asked polite questions about my work before quickly steering conversations toward more interesting topics like market trends and real estate values. It was the same social dynamic I'd experienced at every family event for years, physically present but emotionally peripheral, included out of obligation but not truly welcome in conversations about success and achievement. That's when my father decided it was time for his speech. Robert Parker had always possessed an instinct for dramatic timing, and Rebecca's engagement party provided him with what he clearly viewed as the perfect opportunity to publicly celebrate the daughter who had validated all his beliefs about success, achievement, and the importance of making conventional choices. He positioned himself in the center of our living room, holding his wine glass like a trophy as he prepared to deliver what would become the most painful speech I'd ever heard him make. "Friends, family, colleagues," he began, his voice carrying that authoritative tone he'd perfected during decades of leading business meetings and board presentations. "Linda and I are absolutely thrilled to have you here tonight to celebrate Rebecca and Michael's engagement. But more than that, we're here to celebrate what these two remarkable young people represent." The room grew quiet as 40 successful adults turned their attention toward my father, their faces reflecting the kind of respectful attention that people in corporate environments learn to display when someone important is speaking. Rebecca glowed with pride as she stood beside Michael, both of them looking like they'd stepped out of a magazine advertisement for successful living. As parents, we've spent the last 30 years trying to instill certain values in our children, Dad continued, his chest swelling with visible pride. We've taught them about the importance of education, hard work, financial responsibility, and making choices that lead to stable, prosperous lives. Tonight, looking at Rebecca and Michael, I can say with absolute certainty that our efforts have paid off magnificently. Polite murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd as guests nodded and smiled appropriately. I stood near the kitchen doorway, feeling increasingly invisible as my father built toward whatever point he was preparing to make. Rebecca graduated summa cum laude from one of the finest universities in the state, built an impressive career in marketing, and has consistently demonstrated the kind of judgment and ambition that we always hoped our children would develop, he said, raising his glass slightly toward my sister. Michael brings his own remarkable achievements to this partnership, with his success in investment management and his clear understanding of what it takes to build lasting financial security. The praise continued for several more minutes, with my father detailing Rebecca's professional accomplishments, her responsible approach to money management, her ability to maintain relationships with successful peers, and her overall embodiment of everything he considered important in life. Michael received similar accolades for his career trajectory, his financial acumen, and his family background that suggested he understood the value of tradition and stability. But tonight isn't just about celebrating Rebecca and Michael individually, my father said, his voice taking on a more serious tone that suggested he was building toward his main point. Tonight is about celebrating the validation of everything. Linda and I have tried to teach our children about what it means to live a successful, meaningful life. I felt my stomach tighten as I realized where this speech was heading. My father's eyes briefly scanned the room before settling on me with an expression that wasn't quite apologetic, but wasn't entirely comfortable either. It's not always easy, being a parent, he continued, his voice growing more deliberate. You watch your children make choices, and sometimes those choices align with your hopes and expectations, and sometimes they don't. You try to guide them toward paths that you believe will lead to happiness and security, but ultimately they have to make their own decisions about how they want to live. The room remained respectfully quiet, but I could sense a subtle shift in the atmosphere as people began to realize that this speech was about to become more complicated than a simple celebration of the engaged couple. Some children embrace the lessons you try to teach them about building careers, establishing financial stability, and creating lives that reflect the values you've worked to instill, my father said, his gaze moving between Rebecca and Michael, with obvious satisfaction. Other children choose different paths that may seem unconventional or uncertain, paths that don't always align with what you'd hoped for them. My face burned with embarrassment as every person in that room understood exactly which child he was referring to. The subtle glances in my direction confirmed that my role as the family disappointment was well established and universally acknowledged among our social circle. But tonight, Dad said, his voice rising with renewed enthusiasm, tonight I can stand before all of you and say with complete pride that Rebecca is the one we can finally be proud of without reservation. She has achieved everything we dreamed our children might accomplish. She has built the kind of life that represents the best of what this family stands for. The applause that followed felt like a physical blow, 40 people clapping enthusiastically for my sister's success while I stood in the corner as the unspoken counterexample of what happens when you don't follow the prescribed path to respectability. Rebecca beamed as she accepted congratulations and praise from the crowd, while Michael received hearty handshakes and backslaps from men who recognized him as someone who understood the game of conventional success. They looked like the perfect couple celebrating the perfect life, surrounded by people who valued and understood their achievements. But my father wasn't finished yet. I want to be clear about something, he said, raising his voice slightly to regain the room's attention. Success isn't accidental. The life that Rebecca and Michael have built together didn't happen by luck or chance. It happened because they made smart choices, worked hard, and understood what it takes to create lasting stability and prosperity. He paused for a moment, seeming to gather his thoughts before delivering what felt like a final verdict on his children's comparative worth. "It's not always easy when you have children who choose different directions in life," he said, and I felt every eye in the room flick briefly toward me before returning to focus on him. "Some paths lead to the kind of success we're celebrating tonight, and other paths lead to uncertainty, instability, and missed opportunities. But as parents, we have to love all our children while recognizing and celebrating the ones who truly understand what it means to build a real life." The implication was unmistakable to everyone present. Rebecca represented success, achievement, and family pride, while I represented the road not taken, the cautionary tale about what happens when you reject conventional wisdom in favor of pursuing dreams that don't translate into measurable accomplishments. "So tonight, we're not just celebrating an engagement," my father concluded, raising his wine glass high above his head. "We're celebrating the validation of everything we believe about hard work, smart choices, and the rewards that come to those who understand what success really means." To Rebecca and Michael, who have gotten it exactly right. The toast that followed was enthusiastic and prolonged, with guests raising their glasses and offering vocal congratulations to the couple who represented everything the room valued about achievement and life choices. Rebecca and Michael glowed under the attention, accepting praise with the gracious confidence of people who had never doubted their place in the world or questioned whether their version of success was the only version worth pursuing. As the applause died down and conversations resumed, I found myself standing alone near the fireplace, holding my untouched wine glass and feeling more isolated than I'd ever felt at a family gathering. The speech had made explicit what had always been implicit in our family dynamics. Rebecca was the success story, and I was the disappointment who served as a reminder of what happens when you don't follow the rules. I reached into my jacket pocket to check my phone, wanting to see what time it was so I could calculate how much longer I needed to endure this celebration of everything I would never represent in my family's eyes. My plan was to stay for another 30 minutes, make polite excuses about an early morning commitment, and escape back to my apartment where I could process the emotional impact of having been publicly dismissed as a failure in front of 40 witnesses. That's when my fingers encountered the keychain. For a split second, I felt confused about why my keys felt heavier and more substantial than usual. Then I realized what I was holding, and my heart began racing as I understood the implications of what was about to happen if I couldn't carefully extract my phone without disturbing the Ferrari keys that I'd accidentally brought to my sister's engagement party. But my phone had become tangled with the keychain cord, and as I tried to separate them discreetly, both items slipped from my fingers simultaneously. My phone hit the hardwood floor with a soft thud and bounced once before sliding harmlessly under a nearby armchair. The Ferrari keys landed with a distinctive metallic clink that seemed to reverberate through the suddenly silent room, the sound sharp and unmistakable as they skittered across the polished floor before coming to rest directly in front of Rebecca's designer heels. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. 40 articulate, successful adults stood frozen in place, staring at the impossible sight of a Ferrari keychain lying on the floor of a party where the family disappointment was supposed to be the cautionary tale about unconventional life choices. The iconic prancing horse logo gleamed under the chandelier light, its black leather backing and chrome details making it impossible to mistake for anything other than what it was. The key to a $250,000 supercar that somehow belonged to the daughter who supposedly couldn't afford car payments. Rebecca looked down at the keys, then up at me, then back down at the keys as if she were experiencing some kind of optical illusion that her brain couldn't process. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the shock and confusion spreading across her face as she tried to reconcile what she was seeing with everything she believed about her disappointing younger sister. Michael, whose expertise in investment management had taught him to recognize luxury goods and their approximate values, was the first person to find his voice in the stunned silence. "Those are Ferrari keys," he said, his words barely above, a whisper but carrying clearly through the absolute quiet that had descended over the room. His tone held the same disbelief someone might use when discovering a unicorn in their backyard. My father's face had drained of all color, his mouth slightly open as he struggled to process how the daughter he'd just finished describing as a failure could possibly be connected to a keychain that represented more money than most families, earned in 5 years. The confident authority that had carried him through his speech about Rebecca's success had evaporated completely, leaving him looking confused and slightly lost. "Jessica," he said slowly, as if speaking too quickly might cause the keys to disappear or reveal themselves to be some kind of elaborate practical joke. "Whose keys are those?" Every person in that room was staring at me with expressions ranging from confusion to disbelief to barely concealed excitement at witnessing what was clearly about to become either a major family drama or a revelation that would completely upend everyone's understanding of the Parker family hierarchy. I could have lied. The thought flashed through my mind that I could claim the keys belonged to a client, or that they were promotional items from some automotive event, or that I was holding them for someone else as a favor. I could have deflected and minimized and found some way to maintain the fiction that I was still the struggling freelancer who took public transportation and lived paycheck to paycheck. But standing there in that moment, with my father's words about Rebecca being the one we can finally be proud of, still echoing in my mind, something fundamental shifted inside me. For 6 years, I had allowed this family to define my worth based on their narrow understanding of what constituted success. I had kept my achievements small and my victories private to avoid challenging their preconceptions about what my life should look like. I had protected their feelings at the expense of my own self-respect, maintaining the comfortable fiction that Rebecca was the successful daughter, while I remained the cautionary tale about the dangers of pursuing unconventional paths. I was exhausted by the effort of being small. I was tired of apologizing for succeeding in ways they didn't understand or value. I was finished protecting their egos by hiding my own accomplishments. "They're mine," I said, my voice steady and clear in the silent room. The collective intake of breath was audible as 40 people simultaneously tried to process information that contradicted everything they thought they knew about Jessica Parker. The family disappointment who couldn't afford a car and lived in a cramped apartment because she'd chosen art over stability. Rebecca's composure cracked completely. "That's impossible," she said, her voice shaking with a combination of disbelief and something that sounded almost like betrayal. "You can't afford a Ferrari. You live in that tiny apartment downtown and you're always complaining about late client payments and tight budgets." "I live in that apartment because I chose to," I replied, walking over to pick up my keys with hands that were steadier than I expected them to be. "And the Ferrari is parked 4 blocks away because I didn't think it would be appropriate to drive it to your engagement party." My mother, who had been standing frozen near the kitchen doorway throughout this entire exchange, finally found her voice, though it came out as more of a croak than her usual controlled tone. "Jessica, how is this possible?" she asked, her carefully maintained composure completely shattered. "You're a freelance web designer. You work on computers in your apartment. Where would you get the money for a car like that?" The room waited in breathless silence for my answer, and I realized that this was the moment that would define not just the rest of this evening, but potentially the rest of my relationship with my family. I could minimize what I'd accomplished, downplay the significance of my success, or find ways to make my achievements seem less threatening to their established understanding of who was successful and who wasn't. Or I could tell them the truth about what their disappointing daughter had actually been doing while they'd been celebrating Rebecca's conventional achievements and dismissing my unconventional path as a phase I'd eventually outgrow. What I told them next would change everything they thought they knew about success, achievement, and the daughter they'd written off as a failure who chose computers over career stability. The story I shared with my stunned family began 8 months earlier with what had seemed like just another routine freelance project. but had evolved into the kind of business success that most entrepreneurs only dream about achieving. As I stood in that living room, holding my Ferrari keys while 40 successful adults waited for an explanation that would make sense of what they were witnessing, I realized that the moment had come to reveal the career I'd built while they'd been busy dismissing my work as playing with computers. 8 months ago, I was hired to redesign the digital platform for a startup called Green Path Solutions. I began, my voice gaining confidence as I saw the genuine interest in people's faces. They had developed software that helps small businesses reduce their environmental impact while saving money on operational costs. But their user interface was so complicated that almost no one could figure out how to use it. I explained how Sarah Chen and David Martinez had approached me through Creative Solutions, looking for someone who could translate complex environmental data into something accessible for busy business owners who didn't have time to become sustainability experts. The project had seemed challenging but straightforward. Redesign their website, rebuild their app interface, and create user onboarding flows that would help new customers understand and implement the platform's recommendations. The problem wasn't their technology, I continued, watching as people leaned forward with genuine curiosity about what I was describing. They had created this incredible system that could analyze any business's operations and provide specific recommendations for reducing waste, cutting energy costs, and improving efficiency. But it was hidden behind an interface that looked like it was designed for environmental scientists rather than the small business owners who needed it. Michael, whose investment background had taught him to recognize scalable business models, asked the question that several people in the room were probably thinking. What kind of user engagement were they seeing with the original platform? Less than 3% conversion from free trials to paid subscriptions, I said. And I heard several people intake breath sharply at numbers that anyone in business would recognize as unsustainable. They were getting thousands of signups, but people would spend 5 minutes trying to figure out how to use the platform and then never come back. I described the research process I'd conducted, interviewing small business owners about their experiences with environmental initiatives and their comfort levels with new technology. What I'd discovered was that most entrepreneurs were genuinely interested in reducing their environmental impact, but they were overwhelmed by conflicting information and skeptical of solutions that seemed too good to be true. So I rebuilt their entire user experience around progressive disclosure, I explained, warming to the subject as I saw people's genuine engagement with what I was describing. New users started with a simple questionnaire that took less than 5 minutes, providing basic information about their business. The platform would then generate 3 specific recommendations, showing estimated costs, projected savings, and environmental impact in clear visual terms. Rebecca, who had recovered somewhat from her initial shock, asked a question that revealed her marketing background. What kind of improvement did you see in user engagement after the redesign? The beta test showed a 47% implementation rate for recommended changes, I said, and I watched her eyes widen as she processed numbers that any marketing professional would recognize as exceptional. Conversion from free trials to paid subscriptions jumped to 38% after the full relaunch. The room buzzed with quiet conversations as people absorbed the implications of what I was describing. These were business professionals who understood metrics, user engagement, and the difference between incremental improvements and transformational results. My father, who had been unusually quiet since his speech about Rebecca being the only daughter he could be proud of, finally spoke up. That's impressive work, Jessica. But I still don't understand how a web design project, even a successful one, translates into owning a Ferrari. What I revealed next would fundamentally change their understanding of not just my financial situation, but my business acumen and my ability to recognize and capitalize on opportunities that most people would have missed. 3 months after the platform relaunch, GreenPath was acquired by Ecotech Industries for $37 million, I said quietly. Instead of taking my final contract payment in cash, I had accepted equity in the company. My stake was worth $2.4 million. The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet that had greeted the Ferrari keys. This was the silence of people recalculating everything they thought they knew about someone, processing information that required them to completely revise their assumptions about capability, success, and the daughter they'd dismissed as a failure. Kevin, my younger brother, who had spent years positioning himself as the family's business expert, despite never having earned significant income from his various ventures, was the first to respond. "You made $2.4 million from a web design project?" he asked, his voice containing a mixture of disbelief and what sounded almost like admiration. "I made $2.4 million by recognizing the value of what I was helping to create and being willing to bet on its success instead of taking guaranteed payment," I corrected gently. The web design was just part of what made the company acquisition-worthy. My mother, who had spent years encouraging me to find a real job with benefits and stability, sat down heavily in the nearest chair as she tried to process what I was telling them. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked, her voice small and confused. "Why didn't you share this with your family?" The question hung in the air, and I realized that my answer would either bridge the gap that had existed between us for years or make it permanently unbridgeable. "When would I have told you?" I asked, not unkindly but with genuine curiosity. "During the conversations where you suggested I get a real job? During the family dinners where my work was described as a computer hobby that I'd hopefully outgrow? When exactly should I have shared my success with people who had made it clear that my version of achievement didn't count?" The room remained quiet as my family absorbed not just the financial implications of what I'd revealed, but the emotional impact of understanding how their treatment of me had affected my willingness to share important parts of my life with them. Rebecca, who had built her entire identity around being the successful daughter, looked genuinely shaken as she began to understand how completely the family dynamics had shifted in the space of 15 minutes. "I don't understand," she said, and for the first time in years, her voice carried vulnerability instead of the confident authority I'd grown accustomed to hearing. "If you've been this successful, why are you still living in that small apartment? Why do you take the bus everywhere? Why have you been pretending to struggle financially?" It was a fair question, and one that I'd been asking myself for months as I'd maintained the fiction of being the family disappointment while secretly building wealth that exceeded anything my parents had achieved in their entire careers. "I wasn't pretending to struggle," I said carefully. "I was choosing to live modestly while I figured out what I wanted to do with this windfall. The apartment is small, but it's in a neighborhood I love, close to my favorite coffee shops and the clients I work with regularly. I take public transportation because it's convenient and environmentally responsible, not because I can't afford alternatives." I paused, realizing that I was about to share information that would further challenge their assumptions about my current situation. "But you're right that I've been making some changes recently," I continued. "Last month, I bought a penthouse in downtown Charlotte. 3 bedrooms, city views, secured parking where I can actually keep the Ferrari instead of hiding it in a storage facility." The revelations kept coming, each one requiring my family to further revise their understanding of my life and capabilities, but I wasn't finished sharing the developments they'd missed while they'd been busy dismissing my work as an unstable career path. "I've also been developing plans for my own digital agency," I said, watching their faces as they processed yet another piece of information that contradicted their assumptions about my ambition and business sense. "I want to hire talented developers and designers who share my vision for creating accessible technology solutions for businesses that can't afford traditional corporate consulting." My father, who had spent the evening celebrating Rebecca's conventional success story, looked genuinely bewildered as he tried to reconcile the daughter he'd just described as a disappointment with the entrepreneur I was revealing myself to be. "Jessica, this is incredible," he said, though his voice carried confusion along with admiration. "But why didn't you include us in any of this? Why didn't you ask for advice or guidance as you were making these decisions?" The question revealed so much about how he viewed our relationship and his role in my life that I had to take a moment to formulate a response that wouldn't sound hurtful, even though it was completely honest. "Dad, when have you ever been interested in my business decisions?" I asked gently. "When have any of you asked about my work in ways that suggested you wanted to understand what I was doing, rather than when I planned to stop doing it?" The accuracy of that observation settled over the room like an uncomfortable blanket, forcing everyone to confront the reality of how they'd treated my career choices and professional development for the past 6 years. But even as I was sharing these revelations with my family, I could see the wheels turning in several people's minds as they began to process not just what I'd accomplished, but what it meant for their own relationships with me going forward. The family disappointment had just revealed herself to be the most financially successful person in the room. The transformation in that room was immediate and almost comical to witness. People who had been making polite small talk about Rebecca's engagement suddenly found themselves intensely interested in having conversations with me about business strategy, investment opportunities, and technology trends. It was as if a switch had been flipped, instantly converting me from the family disappointment who worked on computers into someone whose opinion might actually matter. James Richardson, Michael's colleague from the investment firm, materialized beside me within minutes of my revelation about the acquisition payout. "Jessica, I have to say, recognizing the equity opportunity instead of taking cash payment shows remarkable business instincts," he said, his tone completely different from the polite but dismissive way he'd greeted me earlier in the evening. "Have you considered diversifying that windfall into a broader investment portfolio?" Before I could respond, my cousin Amanda approached from the other direction, her husband trailing behind her with obvious interest. "I had no idea you were involved in the tech sector," she said, though I distinctly remembered her asking about my work at previous family gatherings, and then changing the subject when I'd tried to explain what I did. "My husband's company is always looking for digital consultants. Do you have a card?" The sudden attention felt overwhelming and slightly nauseating. These were the same people who had spent years treating me like an afterthought at family events, and now they were circling like sharks who had detected blood in the water. The shift from dismissal to intense interest was so transparent that it would have been funny if it weren't so revealing about how they actually viewed relationships and family connections. Rebecca stood frozen near the fireplace, still holding her wine glass, but no longer glowing with the confident pride that had characterized her demeanor throughout the evening. The engagement party that was supposed to celebrate her achievements and validate her life choices had been completely derailed by revelations about her supposedly unsuccessful sister's secret financial empire. "I need some air," she said quietly, and disappeared through the French doors that led to our parents' back patio. Michael hesitated for a moment between following his fiancée and continuing to network with the room full of professionals who were suddenly very interested in talking to the woman with Ferrari keys and a multi-million-dollar business exit. His choice to remain in the living room, working the crowd and discussing investment strategies, told me everything I needed to know about his priorities, and probably quite a bit about what Rebecca's marriage was going to look like. My mother appeared at my elbow, her face still pale from the shock of discovering that her disappointing daughter was actually more financially successful than anyone else in the family. "Jessica, honey, we need to talk," she said, her voice carrying the kind of forced calm that suggested she was barely holding herself together. "Can you come into the kitchen for a moment?" I followed her through the crowd of people who were now watching my every movement with fascination, leaving behind conversations about my business acumen and investment philosophy that felt surreal after years of having my work dismissed as a computer hobby. The kitchen was quieter but not private, as several family members had followed us, apparently unwilling to miss whatever conversation was about to unfold. My father joined us, still looking shell-shocked by the evening's revelations, while Kevin hovered near the doorway with an expression that suggested he was frantically recalculating his position in the family hierarchy. "I don't understand how this happened," my mother began, her voice shaking slightly. How did you go from struggling to pay rent to owning a Ferrari without us knowing anything about it? Are you in some kind of trouble? Is this money legitimate? The questions revealed so much about how my family viewed me and my capabilities that I had to take a moment to control my response. Even faced with evidence of my success, their first instinct was to assume that something must be wrong, that there must be some explanation that would restore their comfortable understanding of me as the family failure. "Mom, everything I've told you is completely legitimate," I said, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. I built a successful freelance business, landed a major project that transformed a startup's prospects, made a smart equity decision, and benefited when that company was acquired by a major corporation. This is what business success looks like, even if it doesn't match your expectations about how success is supposed to happen. My father stepped forward, his expression showing the first signs of genuine curiosity rather than shock or suspicion. "Jessica, what you've accomplished is remarkable, but I have to ask, why didn't you tell us? Why did you let us think you were struggling when you were actually building something this significant?" It was the question I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure, because answering it honestly would require me to confront years of family dynamics that everyone had been content to ignore, as long as they didn't have to examine their own behavior too closely. "Dad, when exactly should I have told you?" I asked, meeting his eyes directly. "During Christmas dinner 2 years ago when you suggested I go back to school for something more practical? At Rebecca's birthday party when you introduced me to your colleagues as the daughter who was still trying to find herself? When you were explaining to Aunt Patricia that I was going through a creative phase that I'd hopefully outgrow?" The accuracy of those examples hit home, and I could see my father's face change as he began to understand how his words and attitudes had affected my willingness to share important developments in my life. Every time I tried to talk about my work, someone in this family found a way to minimize it or redirect the conversation to Rebecca's career milestones or Kevin's business plans. I continued, my voice gaining strength as I finally articulated feelings I'd been suppressing for years. I learned to keep my successes private because sharing them only led to having them explained away or treated as less important than conventional achievements. Kevin, who had been unusually quiet during this exchange, finally spoke up with a question that revealed his own discomfort with how the family dynamics had shifted. "But Jessica, if you've been this successful, why didn't you help the family? Why didn't you invest in some of my business ventures or offer to contribute to family expenses or vacations?" The entitlement embedded in that question was breathtaking, but it also provided an opportunity to address something that had been bothering me about my family's sudden interest in my financial situation. "Kevin, you never asked for help," I replied. "You've spent years telling everyone about your investment strategies and business plans, presenting yourself as someone who understood money and entrepreneurship better than anyone else in the family. When exactly was I supposed to offer financial assistance to someone who was constantly explaining to me why my career choices were unstable and unprofitable?" The room fell quiet as people absorbed the implications of what I was saying. The family dynamics that everyone had accepted as normal suddenly looked different when examined from the perspective of the person who had been consistently undervalued and dismissed. Rebecca returned from the patio at that moment, her eyes red from crying, but her composure restored. She looked around the kitchen at the assembled family members, taking in the tension and unspoken conflicts that were finally being addressed openly. "I owe you an apology," she said directly to me, her voice steady but carrying genuine emotion. "We all do. I've been thinking about everything you said, and I realize that we've treated your success as less important than mine simply because it didn't look like what we expected success to look like." She paused, seeming to gather courage before continuing with what was clearly a difficult admission. "The truth is, I've always been a little jealous of how creative and independent you are," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I followed all the rules, did everything I was supposed to do, and built the kind of life that looks successful from the outside. But you took risks, trusted your instincts, and created something genuinely valuable. What you've accomplished is more impressive than anything I've done, and I think part of me has always known that." The honesty in her admission caught me off guard. This was a side of Rebecca I hadn't seen since we were children, before family expectations and career pressures had turned us into competitors for parental approval instead of sisters who supported each other's dreams. "Rebecca, you don't need to apologize for being successful in your own way," I said. "The problem was never your achievements. The problem was the assumption that there was only one valid path to success, and that anyone who chose a different route was automatically less worthy of respect or support." My mother, who had been listening to this exchange with increasing discomfort, finally spoke up with a comment that revealed how much she was struggling to process the evening's revelations. "I still don't understand why you kept living in that small apartment and taking the bus if you had all this money," she said, her voice carrying genuine confusion. "Why would you choose to live modestly when you could afford luxury?" It was a reasonable question, and one that had taken me months to answer for myself, as I'd navigated the psychological challenges of sudden wealth while maintaining relationships with people who had defined me by my financial limitations. "Because having money doesn't automatically change who you are or what you value," I explained. "I liked my neighborhood, my routines, and my independence. The apartment was small, but it was mine, and it was in a part of the city that felt like home. Taking public transportation was convenient and environmentally responsible, not a hardship I endured because I couldn't afford alternatives." I paused, realizing that I was about to share something that would further challenge their assumptions about wealth and lifestyle choices. "The Ferrari was an indulgence, but it was also a symbol," I continued. "For years, this family treated my work as if it weren't valuable or important. Buying a car that represents engineering excellence and artistic achievement felt like a way of honoring the technical and creative skills that everyone had dismissed as hobbies." My father looked genuinely thoughtful as he processed what I was saying. "Jessica, I'm beginning to understand that we may have been wrong about a lot of things," he said slowly. "But I have to ask, what happens now? How do we move forward as a family after everything that's been said tonight?" It was the most important question anyone had asked all evening, and one that would determine whether the revelations about my success would bring us closer together or drive us further apart. "That depends on whether you're willing to see me as I actually am instead of who you thought I should be," I said. "I'm not the family disappointment who needs guidance about making better life choices. I'm a successful entrepreneur who has built something valuable and meaningful. I'm not looking for approval of my career path anymore, but I would welcome genuine interest and support." The conversation that followed lasted well into the night, long after most of the party guests had left with stories about the most dramatic engagement party they'd ever witnessed. We talked about expectations and assumptions, about different definitions of success, and about how families can unknowingly damage relationships by refusing to see their members as they truly are, rather than as they wish they were. Rebecca and I had the longest conversation we'd had in years, exploring how our relationship had been shaped by competition for parental approval rather than mutual support and understanding. She admitted that her perfect life sometimes felt empty and performative, while I acknowledged that my secrecy about my success had been partly motivated by a desire to protect myself from having my achievements minimized or explained away. Kevin, perhaps recognizing that his position as the family's business expert had been seriously undermined, approached me with what seemed like genuine curiosity about my work and my plans for the digital agency I was developing. For the first time in our adult relationship, we had a conversation about business and entrepreneurship that didn't involve him lecturing me about financial responsibility or market realities. My parents struggled the most with recalibrating their understanding of their children's comparative success, but they made genuine efforts to ask questions about my work that demonstrated real interest rather than polite obligation. My mother even asked if she could visit my new penthouse apartment, expressing curiosity about how I'd chosen to decorate and organize a space that reflected my actual lifestyle, rather than the one she'd assumed I was living. 6 months later, our family dynamics had transformed in ways that none of us could have predicted that evening when my Ferrari keys fell out of my pocket and shattered everyone's assumptions about success, achievement, and the daughter they'd written off as a failure. I moved into the penthouse and established my digital agency, hiring 3 talented developers and 2 designers who shared my vision for creating accessible technology solutions for businesses that couldn't afford traditional corporate consulting. We landed our first major client within 2 months and were profitable within 4 months, building a reputation for delivering exceptional results while maintaining the kind of work-life balance that most tech companies claim to offer but rarely provide. Rebecca and Michael's wedding was elegant and well-attended, but their marriage lasted less than 2 years. It turned out that Michael's interest in my sister had been significantly influenced by his assumptions about her family's wealth and connections, and when those assumptions proved incorrect, his commitment wavered accordingly. Rebecca handled the divorce with grace and used the experience as motivation to reevaluate what she actually wanted from life rather than what she thought she was supposed to want. She eventually left her corporate marketing job to start her own consulting firm, focusing on helping small businesses develop authentic brand identities rather than pursuing growth at any cost. Her work brought her more satisfaction than her previous role had ever provided, and she credited our conversations after the engagement party with helping her understand that there were many valid paths to professional fulfillment. Kevin, finally, started a legitimate business venture with a small loan from me and guidance that he actually listened to rather than dismissed. His company provides social media management services to local restaurants and retail stores. And while it's not the empire he'd always dreamed of building, it's profitable and growing steadily. More importantly, he's learned to measure success by sustainable results rather than grandiose projections. My parents made genuine efforts to understand and support my work, even attending the ribbon-cutting ceremony when I opened my agency's first official office space. My father, who had once dismissed my career as playing with computers, now introduces me to his colleagues as his daughter, the successful entrepreneur, and his pride feels authentic rather than obligatory. The nonprofit initiative I developed provides pro bono digital services to environmentally focused small businesses, and it's become one of the most rewarding aspects of my work. Sarah and David from GreenPath serve on the advisory board, and we've helped dozens of companies improve their online presence and customer engagement while staying true to their sustainability missions. The Ferrari still sits in my building's parking garage, and I drive it occasionally on weekend trips, or when I need to remind myself how far I've come from the days when my family saw me as the daughter who couldn't afford car payments. But it's no longer a secret symbol of success that I have to hide from people who wouldn't understand its significance. Instead, it's become a reminder that success can take many forms, and that the most important validation comes from knowing your own worth rather than waiting for others to recognize it. My story isn't unique in its broad strokes. There are thousands of people building successful careers and businesses while their families dismiss their work as hobbies or phases they'll eventually outgrow. There are countless entrepreneurs whose achievements go unrecognized because they don't fit conventional definitions of professional accomplishment. The difference is that I was fortunate enough to have a moment when my hidden success became impossible to ignore, forcing a family reckoning that ultimately strengthened our relationships by making them more honest and authentic. Not everyone gets their Ferrari keys moment, but everyone deserves to have their achievements recognized and valued by the people who matter most to them. Sometimes that recognition requires dramatic revelations, and sometimes it requires patient education about different paths to success and fulfillment. The most important lesson I learned from that evening wasn't about money or cars or business achievements. It was about the importance of living authentically, even when the people around you don't understand or appreciate your choices. Success that you have to hide isn't really success at all. It's just another form of conformity to expectations that don't serve your actual life or values. Today, I drive whatever vehicle suits my needs on any given day. Live in a space that reflects my actual preferences rather than financial limitations, and work on projects that challenge and inspire me rather than simply paying bills. My family relationships are stronger because they're based on mutual respect and genuine understanding, rather than assumptions and expectations that never matched reality. The Ferrari keys that fell out of my pocket that night didn't just reveal my financial success. They revealed the possibility of authentic relationships based on who we actually are, rather than who we think we're supposed to be. That transformation was worth far more than any car or bank account could ever represent. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.